Hello and welcome to my commentary on your Google Hangout free for a group comprising of Andrie, Daniel, and Randi. First of all, let me tell you that like the previous ones, this discussion was very well structured, and I enjoyed the equal contributions of all of you, the level of preparation, collaboration, and feeding of the discussion and keeping it moving. It had a very good flow. You covered a lot of topics, and I really enjoyed it. So very nice work, you team this semester. One thing that general comment that I have that might have made it really, really brilliant is that it would have been helpful to have maps or some sort of geographical visual displays for the event as part of a situational awareness or supporting the situational awareness, to where you could focus your discussion, even though this event is hypothetical, it is structured in a way to help you position yourself in a certain environment. So it would have been helpful to have some sort of situational awareness screen map to refer to when you talk about different points, to sort of draw the attention to it. This is just something that other groups have done, or some groups did the ICS forms, initial briefing form, and things like that as part of the incident action plan, and had that documentation displayed. So that was very helpful, but that's just FYI. So I want to start by saying that you picked the scenario from the national planning scenarios that everybody else in a class picked, and I have to comment on that. This is picking out suicide bombers for your event. Is of tremendous consequence when you think about it strategically, because we have never had one. So even though suicide bombings are a way of operating in certain parts of the world, to recently including Europe, the United States has not experienced the suicide bomber event or multiple suicide bomber events. And in that sense, it would be sort of the first, and it would be, almost a black swan for us in a way that it would trigger the necessity to have, as far as decision making, looking for solutions that we have not considered, even in scenarios and stuff like that. But in a real event, this would bring dimensions that are logistical, legal, and psychological, that we have not yet experienced. So when I draw back to the recognition prime decision making and your pieces of experience coming together to help you simulate the option or come up with the optimal option for the situation, this would be pretty creative decision making in this event. Unless obviously you've got people in those different emergency response organizations that are veterans of the last wars and have witnessed, those type of situations. Generally, the American public or emergency responders or public institutions or public administration has not dealt with an event like that. Now, we do have Boston Marathon bombing, the IEDs, but the suicide bomber really ups the ante as far as that event and its impact on emergency management. I think it would bring a paradigm shift in the way we are addressing certain issues. So keep that in mind. I highlight that. It's very interesting. We are talking about, not if, but when. And I would hope in this case it doesn't material, but certainly this is a threat that has been identified in many other parts of the world. So you had multiple suicide bombers. Obviously, that also brings in a multitude of planning considerations. So the way you approached that, you started with capabilities and mission areas as they were laid out in that particular national planning scenario. And you started by discussing the sort of general considerations: how many wounded, how many walking wounded, how many people requiring sheltering and temporary housing. And so you discussed the initial fatalities, 200,000 needing hospitalization, infrastructure damage, blast and fires, need of populations to move to safe areas, potential for multiple events, certainly, and millions of dollars in economic losses. So Randi started off by talking about, from the emergency management planning perspective, traffic control and traffic plans that would, being it the area that it is in, fourth largest city in the nation, traffic considerations would be one of emergency management functions. And again, it would have been nice to have a map here to sort of lay it out, what would be sort of the geographic scenario for this event, considering it is the urban area with some major thoroughfares, you know, the Allen Parkway, Memorial, and 45 and 59 to a certain extent. So, but you looked at it a little bit more tactically, with Houston Police Department being in charge of traffic, and then going into tasks, more of an incident response on activating bomb sniffing dogs, activating aid stations for rendering medical aid, and looking at credentialing volunteers. And, you know, you had a follow-up discussion on volunteers. I'm just going to brush through this. One of you, it was either Andrie or Daniel, mentioned the immediate access to the scene for response, emergency response vehicles. Certainly, you noted something from the Austin State Operating Center on fire trucks and the clearances that they need to get access to the scene. For obviously, you know, you have to keep in mind, if you have that type of event and you have a hot zone, how and who is going to be dispatched to the scene is going to be contingent upon security assessments, right? Because you know, firefighters are not armed, and certainly there would be consideration to medical services and stuff like that on a potential ongoing criminal threat. So think in terms of hot zone and what would be as far as response in that hot zone, but certainly planning for traffic would include proper staging for vehicles, proper access, situating the particular vehicles outside of the hot zone, and how would that inner perimeter be maintained. You mentioned activating or coming up with a plan for a shuttle system. Certainly, the parking structures being potentially compromised, people not having access to their vehicles because they do get public transportation to the venue, many of them, that would require coordination of transportation services based on a traffic plan. Some other considerations, security considerations you had about high-rise buildings versus low-rise buildings, and potential for sharpshooters or other additional threats. And you look at that and you thought in terms of, you sort of went back to planning and consideration for planning for this event related to intelligence gathering. And I think it was Daniel who mentioned that, you know, certainly intelligence gathering, and if you see something, say something. For example, you have a runner that is wearing a heavy coat in a 60 or 70 degree weather in Houston. This consideration relates to the proper vetting of participants in the walk and race. They are all screened. There are some private companies that help with that. Foot Locker is one of them. There are designated locations where they can, get checked through into the race. So no backpacks from them, or any heavy clothing and stuff like that. But that's certainly in the planning for the race is one of the preoccupations, is how to vet people in, and then how to get them out of the race, get them collect their belongings at the end. But you talked about linguistic considerations. This is really huge when you're talking about mass communications later and giving information to the public. Certainly, Houston is an area where over 140 languages are spoken. So, and you're going to have international community as well. With 250,000 spectators, there are going to be people from all over, potentially visitors in Houston and stuff like that. So, in crisis communications, you're going to have the element of considering linguistic needs as well. You talked about preliminary focus on preliminary damage assessment and also monitoring. Daniel, as being part of CERT, obviously damage assessment is something you're very familiar with, and the importance of immediate preliminary damage assessment for structure integrity for potential businesses that might have not been part of that walk around, but they're still in the area and need some kind of notifications or a planning considerations. I don't believe you mentioned that in your session, but and I don't know if you're aware of it, but Houston downtown has 7 miles of underground tunnels that are business entities during a week. So cafes, restaurants, different types of businesses. And so certainly the structural integrity would be very critical to that for the short-term recovery as well. So already in a response, and you plan for identifying all those vulnerabilities there as well. Monitoring, I think the movie Dirty War sort of really brings it to the fore for us, how in the initial impact of an explosion and the initial moments of an event, the intelligence is going to be scarce. There are going to be gaps in information, and certainly you cannot rule out the potential for some secondary nasty things. So Seaburn type of scenario. So that would be part of, the sampling of the air, the predictive modeling if you do have something that was released. And with that, of course, subsequent use of emergency alert system for public notifications and for decision making, and also for personal protective equipment for the emergency responders. You had a good discussion on how that environment would look like. That would be, a lot of debris, a lot of smoke, darkness, fires, tinnitus. I think Daniel mentioned, all those audio, visual challenges for people, shell shock. And so certainly finding ways to notify that type of public, many of them walking wounded, as you mentioned, where they need to go, what they need to do, very critical. And this whole aspect of notifications to the public, you had many different directions going on in your discussions on that. Specifically, you looked at one, if you see, say something that would be probably pre-event, more so than during the response phase, but certainly, witness identification, debriefing, and stuff is going to be critical. But if you say something, if you see something, say something. Daniel, I think, brought out a very relevant point about how do you report what and to whom and where. And you brought up the Florida case on, Cruz being known to, or the calls were being made about him, and to the FBI specifically. I actually have personal take on that. I, being a former FBI agent, I did many duty station calls where we had to take those concerned citizens' phone calls. And the way it looked, regular special agent would be assigned to taking those. And you had your list, you had a big folder with your usual suspects. So there would be all the regulars that call, every Saturday where they had too much of some substance and they have, their imagination runs wild. And so they were flagged, and we were very aware of who those people were. Then you had the unusual cases, the atrocities to animals and things like that. Very, very unusual calls that would come in, and you would flag those, rites and rituals and things like that. And so you did have a general awareness of those phone calls coming in. That was at the time when I was the agent. Unfortunately, this was requiring a lot of resources because it was the investigative time that was being spent on, desk duty for something that's really triage of information. So it got centralized, and those centers, calling centers for FBI, were established to where, those calls are patched and they are not in a local environment. And that's what happened in Florida. So your discussion here on who do people call and who people talk to is really, really insightful and relevant, I think, to our current environment, that we do get those, if you see something, say something. It's kind of like the Homeland Security alert system that existed prior to the National Terrorism Advisory System, red, green, blue, what does it mean? Red, orange, yellow. What are the indicators? What am I supposed to do? So your idea of having specific information with guidelines of, if you see something, call what, call whom, call where, are quite, to the point. So that's one aspect of your discussion on reporting, as far as the intelligence gathering and using a public to support the intelligence gathering process. The other discussion angle is more on actually notifying the public about what to do in that environment. Because as you saw from the movie Dirty War, that public was moved from one corner of one street to another without really any information or any reassurance or any type of management of a message to the public that was in a hot zone, that could not get out of the hot zone until they ascertain how they can decontaminate them. And so that brings in a tremendous emotional impact on people. And if you remember from Drabeck in Emergency Management 1 about people getting out of a collapsed stadium, that if you give people really clear communications and they're actionable, people will actually follow, and they are very compliant in those situations. Where you have panic, and the research shows that over and over again, is when there is lack of proper information to the public. So that's another angle of your discussion and your planning considerations in an event like that. Getting to those people, particularly in a hot zone, and removing their anxiety to the best possible level in this particular scenario would be very critical. Notifying them that the centers are being established, that, those are the routes, that those are the processes, that, if you are experiencing issues with hearing, this is to be expected. Don't worry about it. Follow, whoever emergency personnel. Don't behave in a suspicious manner. You might be, things like that. And certainly that would decrease the anxiety and build trust, because, we're talking about that decision-making and planning. How do you get the best cooperation of the public, which in this event is going to be tremendously impacted. The third part about the communications that you talked about is public information officer. Now, keep in mind, you did not really touch very much on the federal aspect of the event, but this is going to be a federally declared disaster. This is going to be a terrorism event. This is going to be national response framework, fully blown, Stafford Act, and all those things that come with those big ones. So certainly you're going to have a first of all, Joint Field Office, which is going to be for federal resources to coordinate the response to the event. Joint Field Office will most likely be established 99% at the Houston FBI Field Office. So that's one entity that is going to have all federal resources, because you're going to have Homeland Security investigations. You're certainly going to have Secret Service for the reasons I'm going to mention in a second. You're certainly going to have State Department. You're certainly going to have, obviously, FBI. ETF, all those different entities that are going to be coordinating federal aid, bomb liaisons, and WMD coordinator from Houston Field Office is going to be very involved in all the decision making for planning purposes. So you have a Joint Field Office, and certainly in that Joint Field Office, you're going to have some kind of public information function, but also in Houston for the Harris County, which is the third largest in the nation. You have, and you mentioned that, Randi, there is a TransStar, which manages the cameras for the Harris County. But TransStar is also the Homeland Security Emergency Management Office. So Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Management for Harris County. And so because they are there and they have a superb facility, they also have a Joint Information Center established, which is a permanent facility. So if you recall from National Response Framework, when you have those events of national significance like that, you're going to have to activate Joint Information System, which is a network of PIOs from different agencies coming together in one room and sort of crafting their message for the public, for the policymakers, for the city mayor, for the citizens, for the responders, and for all the media outlets. So in a Joint Information Center, you will have all the major players sitting there, the PIOs for major agencies. So HEC, Houston Emergency Center PIO, is going to be briefed in there. The PIO for Harris County, Francisco Sanchez, is going to be interacting with the media nonstop with all the major outlets. The Rumor Control Group is going to be working on monitoring all the media releases and making sure they are accurate and they are providing the correct information that was released to them during media briefings and press conferences. There's also going to be a social media monitoring group, and I have been part of it on many occasions. And I'll tell you that the social media monitoring group looks at all those tweet decks and social media platforms, and looks at hashtags, and both in the intelligence gathering mission and looking at suspicious activity, but also for information triangulation and the information gathering purposes. So this part is going to be activated, and they would have, when you talk about linguistic issues and the language needs, that's part of JIC, Joint Information Center. Obviously, small agencies do not have resources of having 140 translators. So some of the messages, the Joint Information Center day-to-day works on pre-cooking those messages, having templates for different information released to the public, but they also be working on crafting new messages, and translation would be a big part of it. Joint Information Center is going to have to coordinate closely also with all diplomatic services. And that brings me to the other aspect that you did not really cover very much because it seems so external to the event. But the State Department is going to have a huge role in this event, because you have 30 plus consulates in Houston and different nations represented here with their very important dignitaries. So think back to the case of our case of Benghazi and our diplomat and how it rallied international attention. Imagine the targets were affected that are international players. So certainly, and there are international tourists in a Houston area every day. And if you have 250,000 people, a lot of them are going to be international visitors. So now if they are injured, if they're in the hospitals, if they're staying in Houston for extended periods of time, you're going to have issues issues with families coming and accommodating that. So you're going to have a lot of State Department work there as well. So that's something that might get overlooked in planning, but certainly, a really, really important part of it for communications, for releasing information to these international parties that is very important to them because they are so far away from that event, and the anxiety in the families, and it's very, very needed. And I'm going to talk about the case of the Malaysian aircraft that Boeing 777 that disappeared of the skies, and how the families internationally were kept in the dark for a long time. That really affected the trust in the management of the event as well, by the Malaysian authorities. So very, very critical function here as well on that international outreach for not only for the people within the event, but also externally, because this is going to later affect how that incident response and management is viewed internationally. So the public perception, again, about how things were done. So this is this big, part of public information that you talked about. You did look at hazard mitigation planning considerations. Now, if you looked at different forms that constitute incident action plan, which is at the minimum the form ICS 201, and then a 202, 203, 205 being communication plan, 206 being safety plan. There is a form called 215A, which is for the safety officer. In this case, in the planning consideration, safety officer for that event within the unified command, obviously, would have a responsibility to look at all the precautions and protective personal equipment, or rules of engagement, specifically, like I had mentioned, firefighters or medics, where they get in access to, and other activities and objectives achieved in safe working conditions. Safety officer would fill out the 215A, and that would mitigate some of the issues that Daniel brought about. So masks, eyewear, protective equipment for feet, or, if you are walking through rubble or wire, or, downed electrical posts or anything like that. And certainly, just like with the directives for reporting, where do they report? You have the issue of evacuations. Where do they go? So this is from emergency management standpoint. You're looking at secondary and tertiary evacuation locations and starting to make those contacts. And, kind of like in Harvey, when the NRG was established to function as a mass shelter. Certainly, in the pre-event planning, you would look at local businesses, safety, compliance, inspections, and you discussed that. And also coordinate prior and look at those pre-positioning of those potential evacuation sites if something was to happen during that event in Houston. With that comes, big concerns about victim care. And walking wounded, Daniel was talking about triage, and certainly the issues of triaging, depending whether you have, additional substance that you need to decontaminate. But if you just having the explosions and fires and, obviously debris, you're going to have walking wounded, how to direct them, how to make sure that they don't occupy the medical response time, because you are concerned predominantly with the red and tagging of the people that need critical medical care within the next hour. So that golden hour versus walking wounded versus the black, which is people you can't help, you let them be, and they're part of a crime scene at that point. And that's also planning a consideration as well. You talked about looking at NGOs, helping and coordinating those, so Red Cross, Salvation Army, and also all the human capital the nurses, the teachers that come with different knowledge and skills. With Daniel really stressing the credentialing, the identification of critical skills among volunteers and first responders would be critical. What can they do? Can they counsel? Can they do first aid? Do they have skills for that? And how do you check that? You know, how do you credential that? So definitely a big consideration. I think you mentioned the Rocky Raccoon race in Walker County. My students in the past have been part of it as well. And certainly a really good example of planning and preparing to go through those processes. Those people from Walker County CERT teams or Fort Bend County are a great resource to come with mutual aid. And that was really interesting observation, Daniel, because we typically think that Houston, being a large city it is, has all the resources, right? So most of the surrounding jurisdictions are sort of working with Houston and Harris County to sort of see what they can count on, right? When we have something in Huntsville, we'll always go, well, Houston can give us that, Life Flight could fly in here, or we can have somebody from the FBI field office come in or whatever. And so the training happens usually, you know, looking at those big hubs, mega hubs of resources, being able to come with a mutual aid. But now you might have a reverse scenario, because if you have suicide bombers in the largest medical center in the world, and if it happened to take out one of your Herman Memorial Life Flight, Bent Up, you know, all the county services, St. Joseph, you know, burn unit and things like that, if those were taken out of the equation with, and they are very connected in a Houston Medical Center, Texas Medical Center, then you know, it would be the reliance on mutual aid from much less resource entities. And that's certainly where the national response framework would come into bear. But there's also a function in Houston that you didn't mention. There is a multi-agency coordination group called Catastrophic Medical Operations Center, CMOC. So CMOC works with different healthcare corridors and sectors in a region, and they share information about bed availability, about resources, about potential evacuations to and from one facility to the next, and they use WebUC as well for that purpose. And so you would have that CMOC be a critical part of Harris County Office of Emergency Management Operations, as well as Joint Information System, as well as that would be part of, you know, planning for the potential. That would be part of planning for the event, for the rodeo in Houston, and they should. But certainly they could help with some sort of coordination of volunteers that are qualified for medical aid. So nurses, you know, retired nurses, and it would be interesting to see if in fact they do have those type of databases who they can patch information out to. Red Cross, American Red Cross has many of the volunteers from American Red Cross are nurses, so they would have subgroups based on qualifications, and they could, you know, rally or identify those people. Or just planning for the fact that you have some method of identifying those resources. And if you do have uncredentialed volunteers, Daniel, and they just want help, but you don't know what they know, some other part of emergency management, I think, should be to refocus our volunteer efforts from spontaneous response in the response phase to moving them to the recovery phase, because this is where we're missing this critical momentum, right? People get tired, they move on, they go to the next event. But this is going to be, when you look at the national planning scenarios, weeks to months of long-term recovery. With it being a first suicide bombing in the United States, that really expands it even further for counseling and mental traumas and stuff like that. So creating some sort of mechanisms for those spontaneous volunteers to sort of shift their focus to go somewhere, you know, establish the volunteer reception point where they get scanned in and their information is taken, and there is some sort of master list that, and their commitment is received. The importance of recovery is explained to them, and their commitment is secured for long-term participation in the event when it's long gone from the, you know, first headline news and, you know, the first Google searches. So I had some reflections on that. You talked about mobile vehicles, mobile dispatches, and so going into the flexibility mode, depending on where the event would happen, you would need to move your facilities, incident command post, and things like that. You discussed who would be in your unified command or planning group for this event. Harris County Sheriff's Office, Police Department, EMS, Houston Emergency Center is an entity. Certainly Harris County Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Management would be part of it. Metro, TxDOT, that's all co-located at the Harris County Office of Emergency Management. Hospitals, certainly, you know, with 13 plus healthcare institutions there, plus universities, plus schools, plus clinics and satellite clinics. This is a huge enterprise. And certainly rodeo, parade committee, run walk committee, you included them as that private part of a private-public partnership planning for this event. City officials, certainly high officials and decision makers from the city of Houston, foundations, things like that would certainly be involved. I mentioned State Department, and I also mentioned that really you did not highlight the Fed very much, you know, the federal resources that would certainly be coming in quickly from the law enforcement perspective, but also from, you know, certainly FEMA. And again, you know, the food for thought, your suicide bomber, did your suicide bombings were staggered, and if they happened in a healthcare facility, that adds another dimension to this. Media role in it, you mentioned that the media is present. Of course, this whole thing is televised, and it's a big event for Houston. So a lot of media outlets are already there in the parade. And so how would you garner planning considerations for not basically being leery of the media as, you know, the outlet for all the, so to speak, fake news or incorrect information, but how to leverage their help, because we are a tremendous resource. So they put out the hotlines, the phone numbers, they can issue all those information to the public, precise, correct, actionable, and how to coordinate with them would be really, really big part of the planning process. Establishing hotlines would be really critical. Getting access to those videos, again, those videos are easily accessible from the Harris County Office of Emergency Management and Houston Emergency Center. And of course, dogs are awesome. I think Randi said that, and obviously I agree with you. And how is your girl doing, by the way? So using dogs for looking at trash cans, roving patrols, and stuff like that, that's certainly part of the planning pre-event. Screening zones for spectators and stuff like that, looking at implementing spotters or plainclothes officers, certainly for intelligence gathering purposes, and for you know, the fact that uniformed officers are the manifested presence of law enforcement, whereas the undercover operations are really, really critical to special event security. Identification of air support. You mentioned UAVs, certainly with emerging technologies. Those were really critical during the Super Bowl. And we're going to see pretty much them becoming ubiquitous. So leveraging of UAVs and integrating those feeds into investigations. Parking for emergency response vehicles, again, staging areas, that's that critical phase, establishing staging areas, incident command posts, or relocating them based on incident priorities and geographical location. Reverse 911, again, leveraging all those public address system, emergency alert system, that's going to be part of the coordination with the Joint Information Center. And the last part of your discussion revolved around the decision-making and leadership. And certainly something to think about here is one thing I already mentioned, recognition plan decision-making. This is going to be the first one if it was to happen. So what kind of decision-making is going to be displayed? Also, this is going to be the international event that is going to be looked at very, possibly leveraged for political purposes, and all kinds of different interest and advocacy groups looking at that. So when you're looking at pre-existing tensions, political agendas, history of rivalry, and external pressures that are all sort of the enemies of swarm intelligence, as you discussed, in this particular event and planning considerations, those would come into account. The city mayors, the sheriffs, the political parties. This would all play a factor of situational awareness of political climate and at a time to know where those soft spots are and vulnerabilities that could be leveraged by somebody for wrong purposes. So part of leadership, good leadership and decision making, is going to be to acknowledge those and be that good bridge maker and reconcile those differences and be able to get the buy-in and be able to keep people focused on a mission and park their egos at the door. Because in an event like that, as much as people come with a very strong desire to help, there are different interests out there that also operate. So establishing a chain of command for the event in the pre-planning, certainly really critical. Conducive working environment for those involved in the incident, so respecting the different views, different courses of action, especially within the unified command, realizing that tactical decision making is needed in some parts of the event and collaborative decision making is needed at others, as that event is going to vary. It's going to be fast-paced initially, it's going to be more managed later on, it's going to move to executive phase later again, and those different decision-making styles are going to be critical, recognizing that there is a difference how you make a decisions when you are at the initial scene versus how you make a decision when you already have it scene under control, and now you have to think, you have a little bit more time to think about how you coordinate this. So certainly those are really important in building trust. So trust with the people affected, trust with all the people that are trying to help, trust with all the agencies, trust with the federal agencies, in spite of possible local law enforcement rivalries that do at times exist, and certainly looking at, as the event evolves, what are your operational periods? Because with this particular events, the trauma to first responders is going to be huge. When you're dealing with a first suicide bombing, a police officer or a firefighter or a medic would witness for the very first time in their life, the psychological impact is going to be huge. So your operational period is probably shorter to make sure you rotate staff, you control for the burnout, you do debriefs. Debriefings are so critical. Debriefings will make a difference between mental health issues years down the road. Oklahoma City bombing is a perfect example of really well managed debriefings after each operational period. People were not allowed to go and eat dinner. They actually had to sit down and debrief their actions and their emotions, and within a peer group setting before they were allowed to be checked out of the incident and go and eat. Whereas in some other events they were not. In the first response phase to Katrina, I've talked to people that were working there and they were not debriefed, versus people that came in 6 weeks later that actually had structures, debriefing sessions. And the impact, emotional impact on those two groups was significantly different. So a really, really critical component. And certainly as the event moves into the recovery mode, the operational periods can be longer, draw from different resources. Now the funding is going to become available for overtime from federal government and the Stafford Act and all those things that you were learning about. So now there's going to be a different leadership style, different decision making, and also the ability to sort of have a little bit more time for more analytical decision making versus maybe this recognition prime decision making. So those are sort of my my rundown summary of the things that you have discussed. Really nice coverage again, really nice work this semester, and I am going to plug in and look at your last Hangout shortly. Thanks a lot.